Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and thanks for watching. Well, Tuesday's a big day in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thousands of officials will try to get themselves elected, and some re-elected, as the case might be. That and a journalist roundtable after these words.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Welcome back to the program. Well, let me tell you, it's an important day on Tuesday. We hope we get a large turnout. Thousands of people will be running for school board, township supervisors, county commissioners, all kinds of other officials throughout the state. We're going to focus today on Pennsylvania Newsmakers on these hot judicial races. A number of judges throughout the Commonwealth, 67 of them in total, are up for what we call retention. What's all of that about? We'll talk about that and some more. Joining me today is David Taylor. He's the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, and Kari Kissinger. She's the coordinator of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Political Action Committee. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Terry.
All right, David, let me start with you. We have these retention elections. Every 10 years, judges that are initially elected at all levels have to stand for a yes-no vote.
Yes.
This is in controversy this year, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. The some of the activists who made their name quite properly focusing public outrage on the egregious 2005 pay grab have decided to extend their 15 minutes of fame by calling for the ouster of every Pennsylvania jurist standing for retention. Now, my boss, Fred Anton, often a guest on your show, that he and I agree with him, think that's just terribly irresponsible, that a retention election is an opportunity for the voters to examine a judge's record. Usually the judge has been on the bench for 10 years when a retention election occurs, and that depending on the quality of the judge and his or her performance over those 10 years, then the voters render an up or down judgment on whether or not that judge should continue on the bench. And clearly, unless a judge has not served well, that judge should be retained.
Yeah. Kari, let me turn to you on this. Now let's separate these out. We've got 60 judges running at the county level. These are judges in the courts of common pleas.
Right.
We have 7 appeals court judges. These are the judges that do, from the Commonwealth, Superior, and Supreme Courts, the appeals courts in the state. And one of them is a justice of the Supreme Court by the name of Tom Saylor, who's now 10 years, going for another 10 years. And he is in the bullseye, as David points out. Vote him out, says some of these reform groups, like Operation Clean Sweep in particular. How do you think that stands? Give us your assessment of the Saylor situation at the moment.
Well, I think he definitely does have a target on his back, just with being the highest-ranking judicial official who is up for retention this year. And I think his campaign has obviously anticipated that. So I think it has definitely played to be an issue in this election. But it also has, seeped down into the open seats for the Supreme Court as well. I think that's even an issue for them because 3 of the 4 candidates seeking the open seat are on the Superior Court.
Right. So they're trying to move up from one court to another. Go ahead.
Right. So I think that they've also taken that into consideration with their campaign as well, and have seen that as a possible issue, and they're seeking their bid to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, one of the things, David, that I think we've seen, even one of the candidates for the Supreme Court, Maureen Lowry Green, for example, has made some public statements about her concern about voter turnout. And I think given the success of the reformers last year in knocking off legislative incumbents, 17 in the primary, another 6 in the general election, plus 31 House members and senators who didn't seek, House members who didn't seek re-election.
Yes.
54 new members. Are these judicial candidates, even seeking retention, they got a little nervous streak running up their back, don't they?
Well, they certainly do. Although I do think that that things are different this time around, especially when you see the responsible reform leaders, folks like Pat Toomey and Bill Scranton, coming out and saying that Justice Saylor is an excellent Supreme Court justice and should be retained. And so when
and Ed Rendell, didn't I hear a commercial for Ed Rendell, for Tom. I think I did. I was down in Philadelphia earlier in the week, and I think Governor Rendell, a Democrat, has done a commercial.
Right.
Go ahead.
As has Governor Tom Ridge, and again, that Justice Saylor's retention is been endorsed by both the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. So you'll never know until all the ballots are counted on Tuesday night. But for right now, I don't see quite the same degree of momentum behind the vote 'em out mentality.
Kari, the state FL-CIO, obviously an organization that sometimes the chamber works with, sometimes you have different positions on the issues, endorsed all 7 of these appeals court jurists standing for re-election. 4 of the 7 originally ran as Republican, and if I remember this correctly, and I think I do, the chamber, or the state AFL-CIO did not endorse 4 Republicans originally, but now have endorsed them. I think in that sense, there seems to be kind of a congealing of opinion, both in the labor and the business community, that, as David said, that maybe this ought to be a decision made individually. Go ahead.
I would agree with that, and I also agree with Dave. I think the sentiment might be a little bit different than in the previous election with, voting out the legislative incumbents. I think there's a different motivator there in voting out, somebody on the judiciary as opposed to a legislator who actually cast a vote for the pay raise. So I think there is definitely a different sentiment for that.
I think you're right about that. All right, we're going to go to a break. We're going to continue this discussion. We have important elections to the Supreme Court as well. We'll take that up and more following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Pennsylvania Medical Society, doctors and patients, preserve the relationship. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hi, welcome back with David Taylor and Kari Kissinger. Look, let me present the Operation Clean Sweep argument because I think it needs to be put on the table. Here's what they say. Number one, you can't really reform Harrisburg unless you get rid of the incumbents because they are part of the problem. You can't do the half steps. If they've tried half steps, it doesn't work. The other thing about the court argument is that these judges, the 60 judges in the county, and 6 of the 7 appeals court judges took the pay hike. Their argument, I think, is these county judges should have given back the pay hike. You got that? The infamous July 2005 pay hike that they took, and they took it. They're part of the system, and therefore they should be chucked out.
Okay, well, I mean, think about
this. That's the argument.
These folks are insisting that every judge in the Commonwealth should make a political statement from the bench by taking these funds and giving them back, even those judges below the Supreme Court level who never had any voice whatsoever in the handling of that decision. I mean, we don't want our judges to be posturing from the bench, injecting themselves into the political process. I mean, I just think that that's tremendously irresponsible. And again, that's a very different thing for the voters to reflect on rather than perhaps voting against a legislator who voted in favor of the pay raise.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I think PA Clean Sweep, their goals are somewhat short-sighted, and they're not really looking at the long term. There are definite logistical concerns. If you would think about the reality of throwing out 66 judges, the wealth of knowledge that they bring to the judiciary. I think
exactly.
There are some definite concerns about that.
And again, just reflecting on the human capital embodied by our incumbent.
It's 6% of the judiciary, by the way.
Jurists. Yeah, well, and also, I mean, looking at the next term with Chief Justice Cappy announcing his retirement, there are going to be 3 new justices on the 7-member Supreme Court of Pennsylvania anyway, which is why, the idea of getting rid of a stellar jurist like Tom Saylor is just absolutely insane. All
right, let me go to another aspect of this. I mean, look, we're going to elect 2 new Supreme Court justices, right? The voters will, 65% of the voters will have no clue who they are, despite everybody's efforts. Newspapers, run stories. everybody puts out, and the media puts out a lot of information. Unfortunately, people will not know much about them. And the election will hinge on such oddities as turnout in the cities versus turnout in the rural areas, oddities such as the part of the state you come from, oddities such as your last name, is it ethnic, is it Italian, is it, I mean, is this any way to do this? But
well,
go ahead.
I think that's definitely more of a determinant in this race than even necessarily the whole anti-incumbent movement or the reform movement. Just especially with the mayoral race in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, I know there's a lot of concern amongst the Democrats seeking retention or election to the judiciary that with there could possibly be lower voter turnout, just since those races aren't necessarily the most competitive. So I think that will definitely play into the final outcome of the race. Yeah,
Terry, you're absolutely right. I mean, our system is sustained not just by citizens voting, but by citizens casting an informed ballot. Yeah. And in the case of when it comes to voting for judges, it's just a very poor way of doing things. I mean,
but now they can look, not to interrupt you, but now, unlike a few years ago, before an important Supreme Court case, Minnesota v. White, judges were not allowed to campaign. Now they're campaigning, and in some cases, they're getting a little pointed with each other about their views, rightly or wrongly, and maybe that's not so good.
And yes, judges and judicial candidates can now engage in political discourse of that kind, but it still doesn't really tell the voters anything about their most critical qualifications of what kind of judge they would be.
All right, thanks for the update. All right, we come back. The Pennsylvania legislature has been, guess what, debating the open records law. How does that stand? Well, we have two of the state's leading journalists that come on the program and explain it to us all after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education. 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program with Amy Worden from the Philadelphia Inquirer and Tony Romeo from KDKA and KYW Radio, two of the state's leading journalists, joining me as often is the case. All right, Amy, I want to start with you. The open records law. It's like Ronald Reagan used to say, here we go again, right? We're back into a debate about amending this. It went on and on in the House this week. First of all, can you explain for our viewers, when we talk about open records law, what does it really mean? What are we talking about here?
Well, basically, you're talking about the law that governs the public's access to public documents.
Okay.
And there's been a tension, and the balance has definitely been on the side of government in Pennsylvania for years. And this is the attempt by the legislature to try to change that under enormous public pressure that emanated from, of course, the pay raise of 2005. Right. We want to see change, the public said. So the legislature said, well, we're going to respond. We're going to draft a new bill. We're going to move from, we're going to take the open records law and we're going to replace it with a right to know law. The problem is, as a newspaper editorial said, it's more like, the no right to law.
The no right to law.
to know law.
And it's been like 50 years, I think. It was a 50-year-old law, procedurally amended twice. And the point is that, Tony, let me ask you this. The presumption used to be, and we'll see if it still remains.
Ostensibly, they're flipping the presumption.
Yeah, well, explain the presumption.
Well, the presumption basically is that the way it is now is that you're presumed not to have the right to have access to these records, and they're supposedly flipping the presumption so that the onus is on the government entity to prove that you don't have the right.
Right.
If that's
and that's a big bone of contention, right?
That's one big bone of contention, but I think what you're seeing in the legislature here is a lot of the discussion in the House yesterday had to do with how it affects them. Yeah. In particular, like for email records was a big discussion. Are our emails subject to public access?
Yeah.
And then the legislators brought up the issue of, well, what if a constituent contacts us on some personal matter, like a domestic abuse situation?
Sure.
And then
I guess they get a fair amount of that personal stuff, right?
Well, they, of course, claim that they do, but the critics say that, of course, when you apply those standards to all throughout the government agencies, it weakens the bill to the point where it's in one case, when it came out of committee, critics were saying it was a step backward.
Yeah, Amy, let's pursue that a little bit. First of all, if you flip the presumption, which means that you as journalists and me just as a citizen say, I want to get certain kinds of information, but then they put all kinds of exceptions.
Right.
And is that where this seems to be going, particularly in the House, which last week dealt with 100 or so amendments in 2 days, was it 2 days, of floor debate? Give us your sense about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, lawmakers came forward with scores of exemptions. You know, for instance, one that went through the legislature this week was to ban access to 911 tapes. So there's one example. There was discussion about instant messages. You know, what if somebody wants my instant messages? You know, they were sort of taking it to the extreme, I have to say. But there was a lot of effort to roll back what had been you know, an attempt to open access. You know.
Yeah. Now, where that stands is that they dealt with 100 amendments. The House left last week, and they won't vote on the final passage of it until after the election recess, correct?
Well, they are, as we tape this, still working on it. Yeah, they're still working on the amendment.
But they're not going to vote on the final.
Right, and the reason, the problem is that they now have a new rule that says that they have to have at least a 24-hour wait on what they call once they are finished with second consideration of the bill, which is basically the process of voting on the amendments, then the bill has to sit on the calendar for at least 24 hours. Wednesday of this week, just gone by here, is the last session day before the election, and so they can't do it until they come back after the election.
You know, for our viewers out there, I mean, this is a pretty important issue here. I mean, look at what happened with the infamous pay raise and, you know, the kinds of information that wasn't made available that lots of people wanted, not just the folks from the press corps, but average citizens wanted to get. Right. Amy, let me just pursue something else here. Now, some of the focus has been on much of the focus has been on the legislature, but there were also discussions about the other branches, right? Are they part of this process as well, the judiciary and the executive branch?
Oh, well, yeah, actually, in fact, the Senate bill, which just moved out of committee last week, specifically singles out the executive branch as the branch that would be subject to their bill, to the new law. And the legislature, the executive was with 28 exceptions, I believe.
28 exceptions.
The legislature, however, would be completely exempt, because the argument being that they're the deliberative body. But that bill has some components that some reform groups actually support. You've got two bills that are pretty far
All right, we're going to leave that subject. We're going to come back. Snow, it's coming. Remember Valentine's Day last year? You will when we return following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Penn Future, where we believe that every environmental victory grows the economy. And by the Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School, bringing educational innovation and freedom to the children of Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers with Amy Worden from the Philadelphia Inquirer and Tony Romeo from KDKA and KYW Radio. All right, infamous day, Valentine's Day. What was it, February 14th last year? Something happened in the state of Pennsylvania that we're going to remember for a long time, right?
You're especially going to remember it if you were one of the people who was stuck on Interstate 78 or some other highway for 20 hours in some
80
cases.
Or wherever, right?
Right. Well, what happened this week was members of the administration, the PennDOT Secretary, State Police Commissioner, and PEMA, Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency director, had a news conference just ahead of their appearance at a Senate hearing the next day, talking about the steps they have taken to make sure that the debacle that occurred on those interstate highways back in February doesn't happen again, largely driven by a consultant's report. A consultant, James Lee Witt, was hired in the aftermath of that debacle to see what went wrong and make recommendations.
Yeah, I remember some of them. I mean, they were things like the response from PennDOT wasn't quickly enough, and what happened on the exchanges, they couldn't get on and all. Go ahead, you're the expert on this.
Well, there was a total breakdown in communication. Complete. The PennDOT was not talking to the state police, was not talking to PEMA, and nobody was communicating with the people on the ground, the guys in the trucks who were working the plows, or the troopers, or the guardsmen, and who were, so that's why we ended up, I think, with the major problem that we did.
22. Well, how many miles backup
was
it on 78? It was.
Oh,
it went on almost to Ohio. Now I'm going to get into trouble. It didn't go on to Ohio.
No, but I think the real problem was it was one of the coldest nights of the year, and people were stuck out there. There were people who were, there were women who were pregnant. There were elderly people. People who had to be rescued, basically removed and taken out of their cars. Neighbors were bringing hot chocolate to the people on the highway. I think they have taken some positive steps. They've upgraded the communication. They've said that they will get the Emergency Operations Center going, far ahead of the storm. They're going to work on not only communicating among themselves, but trying to communicate as well the traffic problems before they get to the extent that they did to the driving public.
All right, so obviously the Rendellians Governor Rendell's folks wanted to get out ahead of the committee putting out these changes that have been done. I guess, Tony, we're just going to have to wait and see. We get another storm, an unusual circumstance like we had.
Yeah, that's one of the things that they've been saying all along, was that the storm was highly unusual, where you had the snow followed by an immediate hard freeze. Right, you're just going to have to wait and see how these things are executed in practice. One of the things they've done now is they've created what Beeler says, Alan Beeler, the PennDOT secretary, says is a protocol for shutting down highways. They're going to be talking about, when the storm is approaching, talking about the possibilities, and there's a whole procedure to be involved with evaluating this stuff.
All right, great update. Thanks, as always, for coming on the program. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and stay well.